When I think Lenny had reached out last year, and timing didn't work for me because we were shipping our second kid off to college. But I was so excited to have a great excuse to come home to my happiest place on the planet, which is home. So thank you. So I thought, it was funny, as I was reflecting, I wanted to tell a story about what did I learn from growing up in rural Minnesota and how did that impact how I live my life, my career path, and I kept coming back to this word pioneering. And it's funny because I forgot that it's the Pioneer Museum. So I guess it's a quite relevant time. But when I was sort of researching, what does it really mean to be a pioneer? This is what came up for me when I Googled it. It was someone who sees potential, an innovator who's willing to try new things. And when I was looking at the through line of the message that I wanted to communicate today, that's really one of my big takeaways from growing up in Fairmont was this courage and this confidence to be able to problem solve and ultimately take on and try a lot of new things. And so what I'm hoping to do today is tie that back to how the education that I got here, how growing up here really informed this point of view in my life. So I figured I would start with the very beginning, which is I think a lot of us are here because our ancestors not that long ago actually were pioneers in the true sense of the word, coming here and settling this area, which is what your whole organization really helps us remember. A little closer to home, I've got my personal pioneers, my mom and dad, which I just kind of had to start there, but obviously Beth and Roger Neist, were basically born and raised in Albert Lee. And so they had me right before my dad went to medical school. And so I started my life actually in St. Paul. Dad finished his medical degree, and in fact, in this middle picture here, I actually remember that day. I was so bored out of my mind at this graduation. I'm not really old enough to comprehend, but I have a very visceral memory of this. And it was the starting point of Dad was going to build his career. He wanted to pick a community where he could build an ophthalmology practice, and that was Fairmont. And so we packed everything up in our car, and I'm sure a lot of moving trucks as well, and found our first home in Fairmont, which was on Knollwood Drive. I added this picture because I did not know the Holsteins were going to be here, but one of the fun memories of being welcomed into the town of Fairmont was meeting incredible folks on the street and having an amazing cohort of friends and kids that we could run around with. And so this picture on the right is John Holstein, son Jim, daughter Kelly, and me and my little brother Tyler as a kid, kind of when we first got to town. And I threw in, I could not find 5th grade Lenny, so I know you were my 5th grade science teacher. This is about as close as I could get. And you can see I'm right here in this photo. This is me circa when I met Lenny ages ago now. And the cool thing about 4th grade for me was a very visceral memory that I just added tonight because Sandy reminded me of an incredible program that I was part of, which they would pull certain kids out of the classroom and expose us to things that would just cause our brains to explode. And so I was one of the lucky kids that got to go to the library and work with Sandy on this amazing instrument, this Apple II computer that obviously is, a history museum object now, but was the thing that inspired me as a really young kid to learn to program. I remember playing Oregon Trail, which was one of those primitive but very real games that kind of made your brain realize, oh, this is a really powerful tool that is going to do a whole lot more than just play Oregon Trail. So I come back to this, and I actually reference this moment a lot. There's a reason I work at Apple today. So after a few years, my parents basically said, this Knollwood Street is great, but we want to kind of have a farm like we grew up on. And so we call it the farm. It's not really a farm, but Mom and Dad bought some land outside of Fairmont and built an incredible place where we had some animals, we were able to take care of things, we were able to have fun. And so I think this is really important to, again, the sense of what I got from growing up here, which is the ability to work hard, learn how to drive a tractor before you even have a driver's license, as well as have fun and zoom around on things like a snowmobile that, believe it or not, I'm raising kids in California. We can't do things like that. So that's actually a really fun thing to have. I also want to acknowledge that I got to do a lot of other amazing community things when I was growing up here. And I included just a couple of fun photos I had in my collection. The very right is me in a production of Oliver Twist. I'm one of the extras of the poor children in the play. This was at the Opera House many, many years ago. And then the middle picture is the yacht club. So this was a sailing class that I took and learned how to actually sail on Hull Lake many years ago. And then just a picture of a birthday party, and again, just celebrating the fact that it really was a wonderful community of folks to grow up with, and I was able to learn a lot more beyond just academics and things like that. The other benefit of being out in the country was my incredible love of horses, which that first picture is my mom, actually. So I really got to learn this from watching my parents. My mom, turns out, was a fabulous barrel racer back in her day. And so watching her work with horses, actually, she imparted on me a really wonderful sense of, you've got to be confident when you're working with these animals. They have to feel that, and that connecting with animals, taking care of them, cleaning their stalls, all of that stuff was, again, as part of the work ethic that I was really grateful to be exposed to while I was growing up here. Now, I also identified as a student athlete. So Sherwood, Saginaw, and my goodness, I had forgotten. This has just been awesome to come home and have all the reconnections of really important things. But I played 3 different sports in high school, tennis in the fall, gymnastics in the winter, and I did track in the spring. And so I was constantly busy, constantly moving. And what I learned from sports was, I think, fundamental to my career and to how I've grown, over the last many, many years since I've left Fairmont. But learning how to work on a team, to have that competitive edge, to know how to compete, it's such a mental game, is one of those really important things that I don't believe that necessarily fits well in academics, but it's the perfect complement to what you do learn by being a student. And so I just wanted to highlight that I was very lucky that I was in a school that had such a strong athletics program for so many years. So that was a huge part of that as well. I had some work experiences, and in fact, I talked to a woman tonight who said she remembers writing checks for me when I was the lifeguard at the yacht club. So I thought that was really funny. But yeah, I did some really great jobs here too when I was younger. I worked at the dairy freeze. I learned how to count money and get that twist on your cone just right. I lifeguarded at the yacht club, which, again, lifeguarding is a good skill. It was a job that paid well. But my favorite work experience was honestly, starting in 7th grade, I would work in Dad's his ophthalmology office, basically at the front desk, helping check people in and filing things, but most importantly, watching Dad build and grow his business. I will say I also was his, if he got a new piece of equipment, I was the person he would test it out on. So I also got a lot of practice being a very good patient. But this was really, as I reflect on, and I'll talk more about my career path, but this notion of entrepreneurship and building a business and doing what it takes to build something from scratch, I feel like I very much saw here growing up in a small town where there's not a lot of infrastructure. You have to figure things out, and you just have to do what it takes to move things forward. I added this one because Mr. Kerr, you reminded me of Space Camp. It was funny. I had collected a bunch of photos, and this one didn't make my first cut. But what was great is I did have a lot of teachers who were looking out for me and helping me with all sorts of crazy interests along the way. For the longest time, I thought I was going to be an astronaut. Turns out I'm really scared of flying, so that did not end up being my path forward. But I did go to space camp, and again, it caused my brain to explode with ideas of, I think I want to be an engineer. I think I want to learn how to solve problems, like sending people to space, even if I'm not the person who's going to go. And so that brings me to graduation from Fairmont. Now, I was really lucky lucky that the International Baccalaureate program was kind of brand new when I was a student here. I was the second year of graduation. And that was great because it meant that I got to take some really accelerated and wonderful courses. And it also meant when I applied to schools like MIT and Stanford, they paid attention and they said, oh, this kid actually, took classes at a certain level and was able to accomplish this. And that meant a whole lot because I, at the time, had a dream of where can I take this? Where can I go? And I kind of knew that I wanted to try something a little different and get out to a coast. And so I applied to an East Coast school, a West Coast school, and ultimately I decided that California was going to be the place for me. I felt like it was a good match from a very outdoorsy, authentic culture. And if any of you have ever visited Stanford in that area, it is absolutely amazing and lovely. So I moved out to California to go off to college, and it was pretty amazing. And so I got my bachelor's in mechanical engineering from Stanford. And the reason why I chose mechanical is that mechanical engineering is applied problem solving. And I loved it because I could then, after I got my bachelor's and I was studying my master's in mechanical engineering, I focused on robotics. And the cool thing about robotics is that it's infused with electrical engineering and programming, and so it's kind of all engineering styles mashed into one to create something that's really, really cool. And so that was super empowering and exciting to me. So much so that I went on, and I'll get to this when I take you through my career path, but I also went back later and I got my MBA, my Master's in Business and Administration, because I wanted to take my sort of technology footprint and bring it to the business world. So that's Stanford. And then, of course, in robotics class, I met my husband. He was my lab partner, and so we met and got married back in 2000, and then built an incredible family. So we have 3 kids. Merritt, our oldest, is 22. Our son Riker is 19, and our littlest is 14. And we, of course, have a couple of furry-eared family members with our pups. But the best part about raising kids is the summers on the farm. So ever since they were little, they would come home to Fairmont and hang out with Grandma and Grandpa. When they were really little, we would send them for a month at a time. And thank goodness we have young grandparents because they were able to handle all the kids. And those kids know how to ride horses, they know how to pick up sticks, they know how to clean horse stalls, they know how to drive a 4-wheeler. And so again, all really important things that were a great part of raising kids. Another really important part of our family is this sense of adventure and exploring and finding and seeing all parts of the world. So we love being active, physically active, as well as just kind of seeing what's out there. And so as a family, we've gone all over the place from the Arctic to the Antarctic to, to Africa, to just the summer we were in Switzerland hiking and having fun. And so adventures are a big part of our life. So that's the arc of my life. And now I figured I would spend the rest of the time really talking about kind of my career side of things. And I also want to be open about, if you have any questions or want me to talk further on something, just go ahead, shout out, raise your hand. I don't need to talk at you. We can make this a little more interactive. But this is a slide that I use a lot when I'm talking to like Stanford students or women's groups where young women, professional women want advice on their careers. And the interesting thing here is I almost always reference, I'm from rural Minnesota. And it's because everybody in California, or at least folks that I interact with, as soon as you say you're from the Midwest or rural US, they know exactly what that means. It means you're authentic, you're hardworking. And there's so many good attributes that come with that. And I'm gonna get to that more later, but the interesting thing about my career is that when I graduated from college, I became an engineer. I really wanted to take my love of problem solving and working through problems and actually try it firsthand. And so one of the things, and so maybe I'll go over here. So I started my career as an engineer, and I worked at this really cool company called IDEO that does consulting engineering for all sorts of big brands. And this was back in the late 90s. And I got to work on, you may not remember this, but this product up here, that top one right there is called the Palm 5. And it was a pretty iconic handheld at the time. It's kind of silly now, everyone's got their iPhone. But I did about half of all of the engineering on that product. So I designed it, I CAD'd it, I spec'd it, and that project for me kind of blew my mind because it was the first time I had ever gotten to work on a project and then gotten to turn around and see someone in the wild using it who was really, really happy and excited. And that experience and the satisfaction you get from, wow, I helped come up with that thing, and that person is now using it and loving it, it caused me to go, okay, how can I lean in on this and do this a whole lot more in my career? This is really fun. In addition, the company that did that product was a startup. That means they were a small new company that had this great idea and wanted to execute. And the CEO of the startup was a woman. So I was just like, oh my gosh, I want to be just like Donna Dubinsky, this woman who's running this startup. And so the experience of seeing her and her kind of building this amazing product that I got to take part of as an engineer inspired me to go to business school and try to be more like Donna. And so I then went to business school. And so in business school, my whole goal was, okay, how do I go from being an engineer to becoming a founder or a startup person who's creating a new company from scratch? And so in business school, one day there was this kind of famous investor who was talking at school, and I used to be really, really shy. I don't know if the teachers remember this about me, but I was pretty shy, but I mustered the courage to go talk to him and said, hey, I just got done making this Palm 5 thing. This is pretty important and special, but it's missing a really important thing. It's not connected to the internet. We need to make that happen, and I want to help build a company that connects devices to the internet. And he said, well, I know some people that want to start a company. Let me introduce you. And so he introduced me to this team, and I ended up co-founding what became Good Technology, which is the product up in the upper right. Now, you probably didn't see or use that product. It was a bit more niche. It was a BlackBerry competitor, if you all remember BlackBerry. We ended up selling this company to Motorola, but it was a great experience of what does it take to found a company? What does it take to then help build a company? What does it take to sell a company? From there, the investor, the gentleman who I had cornered on the business school campus that day, basically offered me the opportunity to work with him at his venture firm. And so I then did that for a while and was able to learn how to invest in companies. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about what is a startup and what is venture capital. But while I was a venture capitalist for 11 years at that firm, I got a front row seat to all sorts of amazing startup companies. So the firm that I was at invested in Amazon and Google and all sorts of companies. And so watching those companies grow from small little companies to big amazing companies was pretty incredible. And while I was there, I don't know how many of you know like Nest, the thermostat, kind of the smart home stuff. Well, I invested in Nest, so I did their Series A round. The Nest Cam was actually a company called Dropcam, which I invested in, and then we sold it to Google, and they rolled it up into Nest. So, so this was part of what I did as an investor, which was super fun. And then I also took on a public board seat, which was really amazing. I was on the board of Telstra for a little while, which is basically the AT&T of Australia. Turns out traveling to Australia 6 times a year was a lot, so I didn't stay on that board for very long. There's a number of things I've done around kind of women's advancement and helping women, helping more women into the tech industry or helping more women start venture funds. And then my most recent thing was this investing thing was great. I started my own investment firm, and I did that for about 6 years. But I realized that the thing I loved about investing was working with entrepreneurs and CEOs and advising them and helping them scale their business. It wasn't running the venture firm. And so I made a pretty daring change in the middle of COVID. And I said, I want to actually get back to operating, actually working for a company, solving real problems. And Apple happened to reach out, and I was joking, it's kind of that full circle moment, because Apple was part of that original inspiration for me. Even Donna Dubinsky, the CEO of that company, she was an ex-Apple exec. So there's lots of incredible little touch points there. But I'm currently at Apple and operating at a scale that I hadn't had a chance to do before. So that's my career path at a very high level. I thought I'd spend a moment on talking about what's a startup. So right now, we live in California. We live in what's called Silicon Valley. It's the Bay Area, and it is known as kind of the startup nexus of all things startup life. And it's really, you'll often hear entrepreneurship as a synonym for startups, but it's fundamentally company building, and it's usually a group of really smart people who are uniquely qualified to solve kind of a technology problem and do it in a way where their approach is going to cause the ability to solve this problem. You can change it really quickly and have a very high growth opportunity. And so startups, as soon as I got exposed to this notion of a startup, I was like, okay, this is really exciting and cool. And this takes kind of the product engineering that I did and bring it to a whole new level. This is like company engineering. And so it really, really inspired me. And that investor that I met at business school, his name is John Doerr, and one of his famous sayings is, entrepreneurs do more than anyone thinks possible with less than anyone thinks possible. And I do think that is a perfect way of capturing the sentiment. It's all about efficiency and vision and drive, and that ability or the intention to be able to just break down walls to achieve your goals. And so that is what I love about working in this part of the market. This I kind of pointed to the little picture, but this was the company that I helped co-found, and it was amazing. We from scratch, our tiny little team, built a connected device that sent corporate email, and we built a whole company around it. And over the course of 6 years, I had an absolute great experience in learning what it takes to build and scale a company. Venture capital. So this is the other half of the startup. So there's the company side to it, but these companies need money to grow, and so there's a whole ecosystem of groups out there called venture capital groups that their whole job is they go raise money from big institutions, think like university endowments and pots of money where they need to invest their money across all sorts of different things. There's some public market investing. This is called private market investing. And venture firms then take this pool of money and then they invest it into early stage companies. And the example that I put up here is Google. So I'm sure everybody here has Googled or used Google before. Well, Google was founded in 1999, and the company, I worked at Kleiner Perkins, which is a venture firm, and they invested $12.5 million of their dollars in 1999 into Google, and then advised the company and worked with the company, was on the company's board, and really helped that company scale and grow. Everything from, making sure they had the right CEO and management team in place to really pushing on the business model, because when Google was invested in, it didn't have a business model. This whole notion of AdSense and advertising didn't exist. It was kind of a bet on technology and people. And along with all this help and pushing and frankly luck, because there's a lot of luck for how these things turn out, that value turned into over $4 billion worth of value by in 10 or so years. So if you pick the right company, the growth is incredible. The reality of venture capital is a lot of these companies get money and then fail. And so it's commonly known that at least 30% of companies that you choose to invest in as a venture investor will absolutely lose all of your money. And so the joke is that this is not a job of averages. You need one or two big outsized returns, and that kind of makes up for everything else. After I left Kleiner, I wanted to sort of build my own firm, so I founded a venture firm called Defy in 2016, and we raised a couple of different funds, and the whole point here was helping early stage entrepreneurs defy expectations. And so it was intention is very, very early hands-on assistance of those early stage entrepreneurs and getting them ready to go raise much larger dollars from the bigger investors. And so this brings me to kind of pulling this all together. So, so how did Fairmont and growing up here influence all of this? Well, I keep coming back to when you look back at all the different things I've done, I often made choices that people around me were like, sure, that doesn't necessarily seem like the smartest thing to do. Going to California, after I graduated. I studied in a field that was vastly male. That was not the easy path, right? I then left engineering to go to business school, which I got a lot of flack for that one because, really engineering is where it's at, right? This is the hard part. And so I did a bunch of things, and including even, I remember I was co-founding this company, and during that I got married. And then while we were launching our first product, I actually had our first baby. So the other thing is like building a family and trying to have a career all at the same time was, I don't know, maybe not the rational thing to do, but it was the right thing for me to do. And then the most recent thing was I left venture, which a lot of people would say, oh, venture is like, the place to be. But I actually left venture and went to Apple, which is a perfect and exact right move for me. So tying that back to like, what did I get? And this I keep coming back to, it's this pioneering spirit, right? And getting back to, I think, there's an authenticity when you're from a place like Fairmont, and I really think it is driven from this sense of community and accountability, frankly. What's super interesting in a town like this, there's no anonymity, there really isn't. Everybody knows everybody. And I remember that being one of the weirdest things when I moved to California. Like, I don't know people walking down the sidewalk. It's like, it's the opposite. Maybe there's people I know occasionally throughout the day, but the vast majority of people I'm bumping into, I don't know. And so I do think because of growing up in a community where everybody knows everybody, it really does drive a certain level of, I can't put on a fake, front. Everybody knows who I am. And so that is how I show up, even in California. There's definitely this work ethic that I've referenced many, many times, this drive, this balance of, I'm an athlete, I'm a competitor, I'm going to push, but I'm still going to be nice about it. This problem-solving mentality, and then ultimately it's following my own inner compass, and growing up with this sort of pioneering attitude. So yeah, in the end, it's really about connecting. It's about working hard and having fun, and that is, I'd say, the major things that have driven kind of my life from a family front, from a career front, and that was sort of the set of slides I had prepared. This is just a picture of what it looks like hanging out on the porch outside of Grandma and Grandpa's place, the little bit of heaven. But I'm happy to take any questions or dive further on any parts of this that people may want to ask about or not. So just let me know. Yeah.
Is your iPhone any good?
Yeah, I'm not going to talk about anything Apple today. Yeah.
During that period of time when you were expanding yourself, did you ever get scared and think, oh my God, I'm on the wrong track?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, I think it's really hard because you have no idea if you're heading in the right direction or not. I think the thing that I learned pretty early, though, is that I think I always felt like I had a safety net. Like I could try this thing, and worst case, I can always go home, right? And so, I don't know, I guess I always felt like, and I actually attribute this to athletics, actually. I think I learned very early on in life, this notion of trying and iterating. And when you're an athlete and you're learning new things and new skills, you're constantly failing, but you just keep pushing forward and getting better, and you ultimately figure it out. And so I think I've taken that approach into life, which is I'm going to try it because I want to, and I'm expecting failure at some level and to keep pushing forward. And worst case, I know I can always, there's always a safety net somewhere. And so I think that was, an important path for me. I remember when I moved out to California, I never felt like I was going to stay there for probably about 3 years. Like, it didn't feel like home. And until I think that the job side of things started to click. And then I realized that the tech industry was absolutely the right place for me. Everything about it, the excitement of fast-paced problem solving, and people who really want to make life better for everybody using technology, that really resonated for me. And I think once I found that, then I knew, oh, I'm in the right place. So, yeah.
You must have had some good mentors along the way. Comment on that, other than.
Yeah, all the folks at the table here, all the teachers. Yeah, no, this is pretty amazing. This is a highlight actually of being home. So thank you. It's so good to see everybody. Yeah, I mean, I think what is amazing is I did get a lot of great support to do crazy things like Space Camp and maybe overexert myself too much in athletics and all that good sort of stuff. So I felt very supported in the community here. And then I think as I expanded out in California, I think what I learned was that people want to help you if they can, right? And so I learned to ask for help in really good ways. And so, when I saw that venture capitalists on campus at business school, I went up and very pointedly asked him to help me, and he did. So I think there was a lesson I learned pretty early on, which is the best kind of mentorship isn't one that kind of naturally falls in your lap, but it's when you're engaging people and asking for help. And I ended up working with that venture capitalist for over 11 years. So that turned into an incredible relationship where I learned a ton and grew a lot. And so, yeah, I can point to like every step in my career, I've always had that person who, I'm working here because I value this relationship and what, and how I'm growing. And so, even in a startup that I was in, I learned a ton. I wouldn't say it's always the same person. It kind of, I find mentorship in all sorts of different folks, but yeah, that's been critical to my own personal success. Yeah.
You mentioned Space Camp and thinking you're going to be an astronaut.
Yeah.
Has anything that you engineered or invested in or been a part of made in space?
Ooh, good question. Well, I can tell you, so my husband is an investor, and he's actually invested in a satellite company that is launching things into space. And our son, who he's working there this summer, is helping design test circuitry to test the things that get launched into space. So not directly, I don't think, but indirectly, yes. So it is pretty cool. Yeah.
Okay, did you work on the Segway?
Oh, yeah, so the Segway was invested in by, that John Doerr guy that, I mentioned, so he was on the board of Segway. And so I was not actively involved in that one, but I did get to meet, the founder and obviously get a front row seat to that company's, how it worked and then how it ultimately didn't work, which, there's a lot of stories about companies that don't work. And one story that I often tell is, I'm sure you all know Facebook, right? So there was a company that we invested in before Facebook called Friendster. And they had the same idea of Facebook, but a few years before, that was the one we invested in, and they just got it wrong. They were so focused on getting the friend graph to look right, and that's what at the time was very hard to compute and illustrate for the user. Turned out, when you're on Facebook, the last thing you care about is what the graph of your friends looks like. And so that team got a little distracted on what the point of the company was supposed to be, but it's a great example of Friendster was a company that defined the market, the social market, but then totally cratered and didn't walk away with any value creation at all. And so it's a good reminder of how easy it is to get things wrong. So, yeah.
So you talk about mentors and how important they play to what are you doing as far as mentoring others going forward as you're into the next phase of your career?
Yeah, no, great question. I kind of rushed over it when I sort of hit all of those things, but in every step along the way, I've always tried to figure out, okay, what am I doing that's helping me be successful that I could turn around and help share with others to help them be successful. And so when I was in venture, what's interesting about the venture ecosystem is about 9% of all decision makers in venture were women at the time. And so I was one of a very small group of women in the venture capital industry. And so I was part of a big initiative called All Raise that was very focused on how do we bring the number of women decision makers up in venture. And there was a period of time where it got up to 11%. Now, COVID was not the most, not the best of that industry, but that was a big effort. When I was after I founded my own venture firm, one of the things I realized was that raising money for the venture industry was an entirely new skill set altogether that I didn't understand, and I certainly didn't have relationships with the kinds of institutions you raise money from, big foundations, university endowments, those kinds of things. And those relationships, when you have an investor like that, those are like 10-year relationships, if not longer. And so they're not going to invest in you after one meeting, right? You have to meet, build a relationship, build trust, have a differentiated strategy. And so, so one of the things I learned as I was building these relationships is we should figure out how to accelerate more women like myself building these relationships before they actually need the investment. And so I turned the process of me building those relationships into an event, an annual conference called Equity Summit. I worked with two other women, and the conference is still going now. I'm not involved in it because I'm not fundraising for venture anymore, but it was really satisfying because we were solving a big problem in the market, which is these big investors, these endowments and nonprofits wanted to invest in more diverse managers, and then those diverse managers were wanting to build relationships with the best investors. And so it was very easy once we figured out that this was a missing part of the market to then create a forum to build that connection. And subsequently, a lot of great new firms have used that to basically do their fundraising and come into existence. So those are a couple of the things that I'm super proud of. Yeah.
As the industry matures, right, and you were very fortunate, it was kind of the golden years of venture capital, the last 20 years. How are the opportunities there for people? Are the ideas there? Are the returns there for the endowments? Is it still the same as it was, or is it more difficult today?
Yeah, and you're talking about from the venture capital experience, the venture capital opportunity.
For an entrepreneur trying to raise money for an endowment investing.
Yeah, well, so I think what's been really cool about how the whole startup ecosystem has evolved is access to money has kind of exploded, right? So it used to be back in the 90s, a very few number of firms had money to invest. And so they got to sort of pick the winners and invest the money into those companies. And if you didn't have a good connection, you were just sort of out of luck. But with the advent of cloud computing and frankly things like the iPhone that caused a whole app ecosystem to come to market, it enables a whole new kind of company to be built much more quickly. So remember before 2006, 2007, if you were building an internet company, you had to build your whole infrastructure, web servers, full stack, everything. Today, if you want to build a company, you can write an app for a phone, you can write a website, and there's tons of infrastructure that's already out there that you can leverage to build your company. So the speed of innovation started increasing, which meant you needed less money. And so there are lots of different types of investors now. And so what I would say is that the returns of the 90s for venture investors were kind of crazy because the market was super tiny. There's a whole lot more capital available, which means sort of on average, those returns are going down. But that means a lot more companies, a lot more entrepreneurs are actually getting invested in, which I think overall is the goal and the smart thing, because we want more people getting investment. We want more companies and ideas, that are being tried. So I think that whole sort of evolution of the startup industry has in general been a really, really positive thing. Yeah.
Trey, you started out as an engineer, and you still leave a pad of paper and pencil on the nightstand because you like thinking.
Always, yeah. Actually, and it's funny, I do have patents to my name too. I have like 13 patents, I think. And I didn't bring it tonight, but along with my computer, I always have a pad of paper and a pen, and I'm always sketching. And I think once an engineer, always an engineer, right? It's how your brain thinks, it's how you problem solve. And whether you're solving a business problem or an actual technical problem, it's still the same process in the end. And so I do think an engineering degree, I always say it's like the best business degree you can get. And it really helps to have some technical chops so that you learn how hard it is to solve problems and do that. And then there's empathy, as you become maybe more business focused, but you're always partnering with people who are doing engineering at some point, typically. And so I think even though I may not be the person who's coding or, solving the equations to make something work, the fact that I understand what it takes to do the coding or to do the analysis means that, I have more perspective to bring as I'm working with those folks. Yeah.
I'm a teacher, so I'm going to preface my question with that.
Yeah.
Have you ever thought about going back and teaching? Because you seem very passionate about everything that you do. Have you ever thought about going back to and teaching other women about what you do?
Yeah, well, the good news is because I love learning and growing, and so I'm constantly looking for that next opportunity where I can learn new skills and grow. And so as I do that, I do a lot of talking, right, to groups. And so whenever asked, I'm always doing that. And the other thing too, I'm lucky that I live just a few minutes from Stanford, and so the business school, the engineering school, they do a really good job of having a professor who understands how to educate and teach a curriculum, but then they often bring in industry folks to share real life stories of here's how this went down, here's the dilemma we faced. And so whenever I have the chance to go in and talk and share, oh yeah, I know the case study or this sounded great on paper, but let me tell you how that really happened. It was a mess, and and here's what we had to go through. I absolutely love those kinds of things. So I'm not ready to do anything like that full time yet, but always jump at the opportunity and absolutely believe that sharing these things back is really important. Yeah.
So as you talked about wanting to inspire and empower women in the industry.
Yep.
In the industries you've been in, what have you seen as the biggest barrier for women to overcome to be successful?
Yeah, well, I mean, it starts with, education, right? I think I studied engineering at Stanford, and, in that class where I met my husband, I was less than 10% of the class was women, right? So, it was a class of 70, there were maybe 7 women in the entire class. And so I think there's just, at least it's not that bad anymore, but it is hard to feel like you belong. When immediately you're like, ooh, something's wrong here. I'm not sure I belong here. And so I think the good news is a lot of that, there's awareness now. A lot of schools are really putting emphasis on more balanced kind of educational classroom experiences. So that's great. And then, I also think, when I look at the startup industry, just the number of teams that have women on them versus not, one of the things you notice is startups trying to hire fast. And so I'll give you a great example. So Google in the early days was actually had a lot of women on the team. And so it's pretty balanced. But then they went into hypergrowth mode. And they're like, oh, we have to hire at all costs. Well, as soon as they went into hypergrowth, and no one was like, do you have the same number of men and women on your recruiting list, kind of thing. They weren't doing that. They were just hiring to meet demand. And what happens is, there are a lot more guys that were applying for these jobs than women, and very quickly then the balance tips. And then once you have a very uneven org, no one wants to be the oddball in the org. It's uncomfortable, and the dynamic is just different when it's kind of all one group and not of another. So I think the key is making sure that you're paying attention to the balance all along the way. And the good news is a lot of companies are really focusing on that now. It's still really hard when you're trying to balance speed and making sure you've got good representation. It's more than just genders too. There's many aspects to making sure you've got better representation in companies. And the other good thing too is there's a lot of research now that's showing how diversity of thought is really important to good decision making. And so all sorts of good reasons that people know is true, but in the end, there's lots of little things that continue to be problems. But I will say, it does keep trending better, and so that does give me a lot of hope that we're certainly moving in the right direction.
How do you find the difference between being in the incredibly risky VC and going to tech executive at Apple, like just kind of being in those two spaces and comparing them?
Yeah, well, and it's super interesting too, because when I talk to a lot of folks in college, and advise them on how they're thinking about their careers. And I always tell folks that, especially if you're in the Bay Area and you think you want to do a startup and you think that's interesting, I'm like, try it as soon as possible. Like right out of school, like get into the startup ecosystem, because it's all consuming. It is highly risky. And so there are certain times in your life where that's easier to do than others. Right out of school is a great time to take a maximum amount of risk and to see if, am I gonna like this? Am I not gonna like this? How do I do this in a way where I don't burn out, personally? And does this work for me and my risk tolerance, right? Like, I think the good news for me was my goal when I was younger and a new person is I wanted to grow fast, work on new things, that excitement. And so it really wasn't about like, I want the job that's going to make the most amount of money. It was really, my goal was learn as much as possible, have an amazing experience. Yes, obviously I want to be able to pay the bills, but but let's really lean in on the thing that I'm passionate about. And I was talking to some folks earlier, like because of that, all the roles that I've ever done, I really love what I do. Like it's never felt like a job. It's felt like I'm just so lucky I get to do this because every day I'm learning, and then I get to help other people learn, and we get to solve big problems, and that's what's cool. So yeah, anyway, hopefully that kind of answers your question. John, yes?
What would you say was the percentage of successful entrepreneurial startup businesses versus failures?
Okay, so the question is, what is the ratio of successes versus failures in the startup ecosystem? So I'd say the general rule of thumb is that, if you have a portfolio of companies, maybe 30% of these companies are going to make you money, right? 30% of them will be, okay, maybe it's not a big loss, but you probably didn't make as much, you maybe just sort of held on to the money you invested. And then another, 33% to be precise, but that remaining third is just total crater, hole in the ground, you've completely lost everything. And one of my mentors used to say, you can only lose 1 times your money, which I thought was pretty insightful, right? Like, yeah, but in an industry where you can make 200 times your money, you're incentivized to take some big risks, because if you don't take the risk, then you're never going to get the big returning companies. So it is a fine balance of, if you're that venture firm and none of your companies are going bankrupt, maybe you're not actually, trying hard enough, and maybe you're only investing in things that are a little too conventional. Yeah, exactly. So, usually these companies, and it's always great to, even Google is a great example. It's easy to look at Google and go, well, of course that's a great company, right? Like, it's so successful. But Google was not the first search engine. It was a couple of really geeky guys from Stanford who rode their bikes to the venture firm to get funding. They did not have a business model. They were not viewed as being able to be the CEO. So when you think about the risk around the company, it wasn't obvious. It's never obvious when you're investing. If it was, you'd be paying a much different price for it. But and so, it is kind of interesting to see how these companies' paths evolve. And the business plan that you invest in is never what actually makes it, successful. These businesses are constantly changing and evolving as they learn what works and what doesn't work. And so that's why you need a leadership team that's comfortable with failure, because you're constantly trying something and you're like, it doesn't work at all. Try the next thing, and then you just keep throwing stuff out there until it starts working and growing. And then you need to make sure you understand why it's growing, and then you just keep feeding into that until you build your company. Yeah.
Google went from your $12 million investment.
Yeah.
How do you actualize that capital gain?
Yeah.
You have to pay taxes.
Yes, there are lots of taxes that get. Well, so the way that works is what happens is you're buying shares in a company, right? So, in Google in 1999, there was $12.5 million investment on kind of they valued the company. We're like, we think the company is valued at $100 million. And so, then the company would own approximately, 10%. That venture firm owned approximately 10% of Google. Now, the hope is that Google keeps growing and scaling, and if they don't raise any more money, then, at some point in the future, if Google's worth $1 billion and you own 10% of $1 billion, then your value is, X, right? And so you have to wait till those companies go public so that you then have a liquid asset, right? And so that's why IPOs are so critical. You can sell private stock, it's much harder, but once these companies go public, then, and the lockup periods come off and all that good stuff, then you have a liquid asset that then you can sell. And so that's then what happens over time. Whoever owns those shares then sells them off, and then they get income on that, investment income, and then at that point, once they sell, taxes have to be paid. So, yeah. All right. Well, thank you again. Thank you, Lenny, for inviting me. And